Hello, March for Life. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm very excited for our March for Life lecture today. We have joining us this afternoon Sue Ellen Browder, who began her career writing for Cosmopolitan magazine, selling the lies of the sexual revolution to young single women. Now she's one of the best-known writers in the pro-life movement. Her book Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement, documents the many vital facts about the purposeful campaign of misinformation that led to legalized abortion in America. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sue Ellen.
Delight to be here. Thank you.
No, it's fantastic. As I was telling you before we went live, I just love your book so much. I've read it 3 times, and it's a fantastic summary of just the history of the women's movement and honestly how the abortion narrative got spread throughout America.
Right. And it's also a love story.
It is. It's a beautiful love story. So to start things out, let's get a little bit of a history on yourself, Suan. You were recently featured in the Daily Signal. They wrote a beautiful article and did a little mini documentary on yourself, which I thought gave a wonderful summary of your book, Subverted, and showing your just transition from writing for the pages of Cosmo to advocating for the unborn in your current journalistic work. So could you share with us a little bit about your story?
Well, they came out and we taped for 2 days, and they boiled that 2 days of taping down to 14 minutes. And they told that story brilliantly. So you're right. If anybody wants to watch that, they should, because I think they told my story better than I can. But I'm a journalist. I went to the University of Missouri School of Journalism, one of the best journalism schools in the country, and I almost immediately fell from grace when I went to the New York City, and I got a job at Cosmopolitan magazine. And when I was at the University of Missouri, I actually analyzed that magazine for my magazine writing class. How would you sell articles to this magazine? And as you know, I had a pretty good malarkey detector. And I said, I think a lot of these stories in this magazine are made up. I don't think they're real. And when I got to Cosmo, sure enough, they weren't. They were making up stories. And Helen Gurley Brown, even who was the editor at the time, changed Cosmo from kind of a general interest magazine into a sex rag. And she had a list of rules on how to make up stories about these women who are having all these wonderful times, jumping in bed with men all the time and having these wonderful lives. And women who are sitting at home in the suburbs with 3 kids going, oh, I wish I could live like that. I wish I could have fun like that. Of course, these were lies. And so this was sold to the American public, and it's created a very great problem, many great problems.
Yeah. So how specifically, once you started working for Cosmo, how did you sell the narrative of this Cosmo girl, and how did that then play into selling the live abortion?
You have to understand how propaganda works. People don't understand that propaganda is not just a bunch of lies. It's half-truth, limited truth, and truth out of context. If it were just a bunch of lies, we could all tell. But it's those little truths that are the problem, because you get confused. You think, oh, I believe that, I believe that. So Edward Bernays, who was the Sigmund Freud's nephew, wrote a book called Propaganda in the 1920s, and he was actually kind of considered the father of public relations. So how do you sell, he said, for example, how do you sell a piano to the middle class? You sell a piano, which is a very high-ticket item for a middle-class family. You sell it by having all these beautiful pictures in these fancy magazines, in House Beautiful, Architectural Digest, of people who have music rooms. And once you sell the idea of the music room, people will say, I got to have a piano. Well, how do you sell beautiful clothes, makeup, abortion, contraceptives, all of these things in the magazine, all the things that they're selling, the clothes, single travel, alcohol, all of the things that are in magazines? You sell it by selling the Cosmo lifestyle. And once you've sold the Cosmo lifestyle to a young woman, she'll just think, I got to have this stuff. So that's how propaganda works. And young women don't realize it. And of course, now they're selling young women all of these things at a very young age, 12 and 15, before they can even think. And on their cell phones. I mean, it's just awful. It's really hard for young people to sort it out when they can't really even think yet.
Oh, it's so true. And you see so many more magazines like Cosmo being targeted at that younger demographic now.
Why? Because it's profitable.
Mm-hmm.
If a young woman doesn't know who she is, and when we're young, we don't know who we are yet, then they can sell all this stuff. Well, we're going to tell you who you are. And once we tell you who you are, but you're going to have to buy all this stuff to be the person we're selling you. And so they sell them on. You'll notice all these magazines and everything I get in my email, everything is, it's all about you, but it's really not. It's all about them selling you what they want you to buy. Right?
It's so true. So one of the elements that I found just really humorous in your book, Subverted, was how you juxtaposed your own lifestyle to that of the Cosmo girls that you were writing about. One of the really funny narratives was your cross-country trip with your family and your dog. Um, and so you were a young wife, a mom of two, and you'd settled down in the suburbs. And yet in the pages, you were selling this glamorous narrative of a sexually liberated woman who got ahead utilizing abortion when she needed it, quote
Right.
unquote, needed it. So what was it like writing such a different narrative than the life that you yourself were living?
Well, it's interesting because all of the editors, or a number of the editors I knew at Cosmo, were also living a very ordinary life, if you will. Helen Gurley Brown was married to the same man for 50 years, even as she was selling divorce. So there are a lot of people at Cosmo who were living these double lives. Now, how was that for me? Well, when you live a double life, you have a lot of turmoil inside,
Mm-hmm.
and so in the middle of all this, even though I had this beautiful family and I was living this wonderful life, there was also a lot of anxiety, depression, a lot of conflict inside that you don't recognize. That interior life you've got to deal with that, And so there was conflict there. I don't, it's very kind of you to say it was humorous, that you found it humorous, because a lot of people find it very disgusting, you know. So anyway, but I grew up. It took a while, though. It took many years. I came into the Catholic Church when I was 57, and that is when I began to change my mind and my heart about abortion. And I began to meet a lot of very intelligent, smart, liberated women who were pro-life, and I'm like, wow, this is interesting. And and when I was in New York, all the women's magazine editors were pro-abortion, all of them. It was just a natural thing. In fact, in this new book, Sex and the Catholic Feminist, there's a chapter in there where we talk about all these women getting together one time and planning to run pro-abortion articles in a certain issue. I mean, all these magazines. So, but when I came into the Catholic Church, I began to find pro-life, liberated pro-life women. And then I went to the March for Life, or the Walk for Life in San Francisco. And I could not believe it. All of these beautiful people walking, singing and praying, and there was nothing. This had not been reported in the news. I had not seen it, and I looked at that and I said, "Wow, the media have missed this, and I'm one of the ones that have missed it." And I think that was the moment when I finally said, "Okay, all right, yeah, I was wrong about that abortion stuff. We got to." So then that's when I started writing that book. Subverted, how I helped the sexual revolution hijack the women's movement. And how did I do it? Well, by propaganda. We see how propaganda works.
No, that's so true. So one question I have for you, what originally started you off on the other side of the spectrum? So kind of joining into the feminist mantra, believing in the abortion narrative. What moment in your life did you start to follow that more feminist mindset?
Well, you have to remember in the 1960s and 70s, women were fired for being pregnant. I was fired for being pregnant as a young woman working at a newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I came to New York City, the feminist movement was in full swing. People were marching in the streets and stuff. And one thing they were marching for is for women not to be fired for being pregnant. And so I'm like, well, I'm one of these. But what I didn't realize, as I say, and as you know from my book, is that abortion got inserted in the women's movement. Um, that was, again, see, half truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. All of the things, the rights that the National Organization for Women were proclaiming, I believed in. And then they threw in abortion. And so I just bought that hook, line, and sinker too. When in fact, I was for equal rights for women in academia and the workforce. I was for women going into medical school. I was for women voting. I mean, even though we had the vote then, but I was for equal pay for equal work. I was for all of those things. There was that one thing, abortion, that I didn't realize had been inserted
Mm-hmm.
in that list of otherwise very admirable things.
Oh, that's so true. So, could you actually dive in a little bit more about the history of the abortion lobby overtaking the women's movement? I find that element of Subverted so fascinating. Um, just seeing how the wonderful elements that you were talking about during the 60s and 70s of the women's movement and trying to really bring about equality that women didn't see in the workforce, especially. But then you start seeing a shift in the 70s in particular
Mm,
towards the abortion narrative
mm,
and the sexual revolution.
which are combined.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, really. Um, with one thing that I noticed when I was working, see, I worked on staff at Cosmo for maybe it was less than a year, and then I went freelance for another 25 years or so. But I worked on staff, and the one thing that I noticed there it was the little seed that this book grew out of. The women's movement, the feminist movement, and the sexual revolution in those days were two radically different movements. Helen Gurley Brown would have loved for her sex magazine, Cosmo, to be part of the women's movement. But Betty Friedan, who had launched the women's movement in 1963 with her book, The Feminine Mystique, called Cosmo quite obscene and quite horrible. So how did those two
Mm-hmm.
get joined together? That was the little question that people kept asking me after I became Catholic, and I said, I don't know. And so as an investigative reporter, I started to dig into it. And it took me many years. Is actually this book started in 2009. It was published in 2015, and now there's a new book out in Sex and the Catholic Feminist that was just published this year. So I've been working on this for 10 years, over 10 years. And so what happened was Betty Friedan had a friend, a magazine writing friend named Larry Lader. He and Dr. Bernard Nathanson were the co-founders of what's now NARAL Pro-Choice America.
Mm-hmm.
Their greatest goal was to make abortion legal. In those days, the abortion movement was run largely by upper class white men.
Mm-hmm.
They were after abortion, and they wanted to legalize abortion all over the country. Larry Lader was Margaret Sanger's biographer, and he was also a radical sexual libertarian. He said that to tamper with abortion meant the whole sexual morality in America would come tumbling down.
Mm-hmm.
Right about that. He was right about that. So he tried to convince Betty Friedan to insert a demand for abortion in the Feminist Bill of Rights. And for a long time, Betty resisted that. She didn't see that abortion was really necessary for women as a right. But over time, he convinced her. And we don't know exactly what he said. Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who actually, had been an abortionist and claimed responsibility for 75,000 abortions. Not that he did them all personally, but he was in charge of an abortion mill, if you will. He worked with Larry Lader, and he became pro-life, very pro-life before he died, and Catholic. And he said that one thing that they did was they may have convinced Betty that she wouldn't get all her other rights inserted through Congress unless she also included the abortion right. You remember now, this is a time when women were being fired for being pregnant. So if
Mhm.
you say to corporate America, it's okay, boys, if she'll be on the pill, and if the pill fails, she'll get an abortion. Then maybe equal rights for women, especially equal pay for equal work, made a little more sense. It's hard to say. That's just a guess, but that's a backstory that we don't know completely. But at
Mhm.
any rate, he did convince her to insert abortion in the women's movement, and we know the actual night that it happened. And that took me a number of years to find out. It was on November 18th, 1967, in the Chinese room of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., when about 105 people, mostly women, a couple, three men, feminists, met for the second annual convention of the National Organization for Women. And their goal that night or that day and night, was to vote on a Bill of Rights, political Bill of Rights for feminists to embrace. They voted on 8 rights that day and that night. Okay, most of them are things that we all agree on: equal pay for equal work. And women shouldn't be fired for being pregnant. Women should be able to serve on a jury. In some states, women weren't able to serve on juries. Uh, um, a family should be able to deduct child care expenses on their income taxes. All of
Mhm.
these things are things that we agree on. There were only 2 rights that day and night that created an uproar. One was the Equal Rights Amendment.
Mhm.
That's interesting because today some people are trying to reinstate that Equal Rights Amendment. I wouldn't worry about that. Even Justice Ginsburg, who is very, very pro-choice, has said they'd have to start that all over again.
Mhm.
ERA is dead until they start. So all that's just a bunch of political malarkey. Okay, so forget about the ERA. That was one of the things they fought over. Now, these are feminists that fought over this. The other thing they fought over, and they fought till almost midnight, was over the abortion right. Women were screaming. People were saying, "I'm against murder." All the things that people have been saying in our culture today were said in that little room that night. It was like a microcosm of what's still going on today. And after that dust settled, it was almost midnight. And Betty Friedan was a powerful lady, and she rammed this through because she thought once she was convinced of something, she did it.
Mhm.
As when the dust settled, only 57 women, 57 people in that room had voted to insert abortion as a right into the women's movement. And 1/3 of those ardent feminists, founders of NOW, walked out and later resigned from NOW over the abortion vote. So this battle I say that this was the genesis moment of the battle over abortion that we're still fighting today, years and years, decades yet later. And it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. But where did those women go? The ones that resigned, those were pro-life women. One woman who was Betty Boyer, she was a lawyer in Cleveland, Ohio. She said a baby is a sacred trust. Those women went and they founded another organization called WHEEL, the Women's
Mhm.
Equity Action League. Now, people have not heard of this because when I was in Cleveland, even the pro-lifers I spoke to in Cleveland had not heard of Betty Boyer and her group. But WHEEL did a lot of wonderful good work. They fought to get rid of help wanted male and help wanted female ads in newspapers. They fought to give for sports programs for young women. They fought for the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which made it illegal for a woman to be fired for being pregnant. They fought for the Equal Opportunity Act of 1974. I don't know, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which made it illegal to discriminate against a woman who was married in terms
Mhm.
of giving her credit. So they fought for lots of things and they won lots of things. But I think it's safe to say that they didn't want the publicity because they didn't want people to know they didn't want their bosses to know that there were some of those women out marching on the streets. So when the pro-choice feminists wanted the publicity. They said, "Oh, just let them have it." And as a result, I think it's safe to say that the pro-life feminists that walked out of that room that night, won a lot of the victories that we now take for granted today. And the pro-choice feminists got most of the media credit. I think that's safe to say.
That's a fantastic take on all of it. And I really encourage everyone also to read your book, Subverted. It really just dives so deep into this topic. And I remember reading it for the first time and hearing the vote of the 57 and having never heard of that before, and that the decision to change the direction of the women's movement forever really was decided by a very small majority of the women of now, and that it split the organization in half.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. That chapter 5 in that book allows you to go into that room and live that story. And that was how did I get that information? Because it had never been reported before. The National Organization for Women has its papers housed at the Schlesinger Library in Boston, Harvard, and Radcliffe. And you have to get their permission to get in. And so I said to a friend of mine, I says, they're not going to give me permission to get in. And she says, yeah, try it. They might. And I asked them for permission. I had it within a week. And so I was able to go into that library, and the librarians there, to be honest, I was researching this. Investigative reporting is always expensive, and you never have enough money to do it. So I was working at JCPenney selling jewelry as I was writing this book to make ends meet. And I didn't have the money to go to Boston from California to look at those papers, but the librarians at the Schlesinger Library will do 150 pages of research for you a year and send you the information by email for a pittance of money. And it was December. So I could get 150 pages in December, and I could get 150 pages in January. And because I was sight unseen, I didn't know what I was asking for, so I had to just kind of stab around in the dark. But I got enough stuff. Some of it was just garbage, but I got enough stuff. I got letters that were written by women who resigned from the organization, who walked out of that meeting that night and told what had happened. They had written those letters, and they were furious, and they'd written those letters within a day or two of the meeting. So this was eyewitness stuff that had never been reported before. So it was good to find.
It's great information to know. So, in your opinion, how is abortion opposed to the original efforts of the women's movement and the well-being of women today?
Well, women shouldn't have to choose between having a job and having a baby. I mean, we should be able to have both. And we should have more family-friendly policies. We would have more family-friendly policies in corporations if we didn't have abortion as an option. We'd have more family-friendly policies in colleges so women could finish their college educations. I think the truth of the matter is that women on both the right and the left, if you will, what we call the right and the left, really agree on a lot more than we think we do. For example, the Me Too movement is also protesting the sexual revolution. So we're protesting the same thing. We're protesting the idea that women should be treated as sex objects. And what does abortion and contraceptive do? Well, the Humane Vitae told us what it would do. Men would see women as objects to be used for their sexual pleasure. And what has happened? Men are seeing women as objects to be used for their sexual pleasure. So we are all protesting the sexual revolution, the false joining of the sexual revolution with the feminist movement. And that's why I say the pro-life family feminist movement, the pro-life movement, is the authentic feminism of the 21st century.
Yeah. So if you could give one piece of advice to the pro-life movement, what would it be?
Well, I think I'd like to see them pray and fast until God tells you what to do, and then do it. I think we have to stay centered on love. We have to stay centered on the people that we love, and recognize that those people who are pro-abortion, there's conflict inside. There's a lot of conflict inside. I had it when I was pro-abortion, especially if they've had an abortion, which I did have. So there's a lot of conflict inside, and all that anger that's coming is from conflict. And we can't answer that with anger. We have to answer with love.
That's a great message for today. And you've mentioned it already, but do you have any new writing projects underway? And how can our viewers best follow your upcoming work?
Well, this Sex and the Catholic Feminist, which is my new book, here's a picture of it. I strongly encourage women to get this. It's only about 100 pages, and it telescopes that whole history so they can see how it works, and it talks about what feminism was originally all about. What did Betty Friedan say feminism was all about? She said it was about a woman's personhood. And that's what we're fighting over today, is what is a woman? What is a woman? Who is a woman? And I think we've got the answers.
Well, thank you for that, Sue Ellen. And thank you so much for joining us today. This really was insightful into the history of the women's movement, and I think a really uplifting message for all of us to hear about giving hope and love towards women and all life.
That's right. That's right. That's the answer.
And thank you also to all of our viewers today. We hope to see you again as we continue on with our March for Life lecture series and bringing on amazing speakers in the pro-life movement to be able to share the history, insight into the movement, and giving this message of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.